Well, hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. Ottawa's new laws to reshape the internet are actually reshaping what we read, what we hear. It silences some voices, it promotes others, but not necessarily voices that we might choose as consumers. These new bills, C11 and C18, really don't give us more diverse voices or access to more information. It kind of limits all of the above. It's certainly not about more free speech or more free choice. These new laws are also a forced redistribution of wealth. That seems like an old phrase. From a successful industry to a failing one, from big tech to legacy media. And the latter is already pretty heavily subsidized. So let's call it what it is, a power grab that increases Ottawa's power to regulate and tax. And as consumers, are we really going to be benefiting from this? Our guest says it's hard to overstate the harm created by these bills. Dr. Michael Geist, law professor at the University of Ottawa, where he holds the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce law. Hi, Michael. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well, Senator Wallin. Thanks again for having me.
So please, just Pamela, it's fine. Just explain what you mean, that it's hard to overstate the harm that these two bills will in the end unleash.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in some ways this is a classic case of be careful what you wish for, you just might get it, because both of these bills have now been passed. It didn't take more than a few minutes, effectively, for Meta to confirm yet again that its intention is to block news on its platforms, Facebook and Instagram, and we'll see that, I think, roll out over the next little bit. Google is now talking to the heritage minister, according to reports, and so it finally took, I think, the realization that Google may exit as well for them to finally be willing to discuss. So we way well on C18 find ourselves in an environment where Canadian news is blocked, at least for news sharing. And that's going to cause enormous harm, I think, to the sector. And on C11, we can get into as well. CRTC has started the consultations. We've got Canadian broadcasters already looking to cut back on their CanCon commitments. And we've got foreign streamers, in some instances, saying that they're considering blocking Canada as a market, given the regulatory costs. So the impact is happening pretty swiftly.
It just seems so bizarre that in a world where the internet itself was invented so that communication would be infinite and limitless, and we would all be able to have access to more information. For better or worse, we've got rules around it. We've got hate speech laws that have been there since 1970. We've got copyright laws to protect people that generate information. That we would, what seems to me to be a very, very heavy hand of the state saying, no, we're going to regulate this sector. And the outcome is less information all around and controlled information all around. Who gets to decide what we're seeing and hearing and reading?
Well, I think there are some real risks, and certainly the WHO in many ways is the CRTC in terms of exerting a greater level of control. I think in both cases of these bills, it's unprecedented. I think in the case of media, your committee heard repeatedly concerns about vesting that kind of power in the broadcast and telecoms regulator, and I think that we're seeing that play out as well with the kind of power they have, and some concerns about it, just how arm's length it is in terms of some of the decisions that it's been making from the government. But to me, it isn't just no. I think those concerns are very real, and it's not just the control or even that notion of the kind of the regulatory choices. I do think you can make a compelling case for regulation, more regulation even than we have right now. But the choices that the government made in the case of C11 to effectively say that all streaming services anywhere in the world were subject to Canadian regulation unless somehow exempted, as well as you know, including things like regulating user content, which is effectively confirmed now by the policy direction, which seeks to ask the CRTC to exclude it. But if it wasn't there, there would be no reason to include that in the policy direction. And in the case of C18, there were better options to get these platforms to make more significant contributions in Canada, if you feel that they don't do that, without imperiling their participation in the sector more broadly.
Well, two things on that. They basically did say, tax us, create a fund, we'll donate to it. You decide how we're going to encourage more journalism and more sustainable journalism in this country. But we don't want to get into the business of deciding what and who should be on the internet, which seems like a very reasonable proposition for people whose job it is to just be the highway, to just be the transmission line there. And so they've given them that option, and government goes, no, we want you to pay and pay again. These guys were already putting this content up that people want to be promoted and paid for. They were doing it for free. It was there for all of us to read.
Yeah, no, this was C-18, as you're talking about, is one of those bills that I have to admit, a lot of conversations I'd have, sometimes with media, sometimes with colleagues or friends or whoever it happened to be. It was one of those things where people thought, you must surely be joking or must be getting this wrong. Because it just, I think intuitively didn't make a lot of sense to people to say that publishers are voluntarily posting the majority of links, let's say on a social media network. It is driving free traffic back to those sites, which results in obviously more visitors, more ad revenue, potentially more subscribers. It's the benefits there are pretty clear cut. It's not use in the way of the content in the way people would typically think of it, because they aren't copying full text. And yet into that, the government says, well, we think that you ought to be paying for the privilege of sending that traffic onto these sites. And oh, by the way, it may be the case that you say that just isn't very valuable to you. It's a small part of the overall of people's feeds, and is highly substitutable. People spend roughly the same amount of time on the platform, whether it's news links or looking at photos of friends. But we think you're on the hook, and it's going to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And we're not even going to give you a cap or a sense of precisely how much. Just know that you've got uncapped liability for those links that run into the hundreds of millions of dollars. And then express surprise when the companies say, if that's the deal, and the options are to link and pay or stop linking and not have to pay, they're going to choose the prospect of simply not linking anymore. It's just not economic.
As they watched themselves, as we all did through this process, when it started out, there were a couple of hundred organizations that were going to be subsidized through this forced payment. By the time the bill passed, it was already up to 700 organizations, groups, any group of two people that got together and said, here, my newsletter is a news organization. Google's got to pay them. That is, unlimited liability, and no corporation signs up for that, or their board of directors would fire them all.
Yeah, no, that the inclusion of more and more organizations as so-called eligible news businesses is yet another source of concern. And it makes it feel like at the end of the day, this is just more of a subsidy program than any sort of genuine compensation for value. In fact, there was an attempt by one of your Senate colleagues, Senator Ville-Deschênes, to include more of that the values that go back and forth in these transactions. It was put in as an amendment in the bill to make sure that that was clear. And yet the government rejected that as well when it came to this bill. So you're left with a bill that doesn't feel like it's really about so-called value. Instead, it really is this attempt to say, hey, you have money and we'd like you to pay. And no one should be surprised that the response is, well, the way that you've structured the law, it gives us the option to simply stop doing that. And that's going to cause real harm. In fact, I would say that the harm here is going to be far more significant than I think was even appreciated by the government. It is not just that its estimates of the hundreds of millions being generated simply won't come to fruition. Even if it's only Meta that gets out of this business, right? Then at best, maybe it's break even if you take into account some of the lost traffic versus the benefits they might get if Google does participate. But the existing deals that are there, those are jeopardized as well. Obviously, in Meta's case, there's little reason for Meta to continue to support the sector if it's no longer engaged in supporting that sector. And even for Google, if they strike a deal saying, okay, we've got to do this, do their existing deals count? And do they walk away from some of those existing deals? Because you're now saying, well, you got to pay for every link. Well, if you're paying for links, why do I need to pay for all this content? What's the value proposition there?
The thing is that we've already seen pretty substantial evidence that the subsidies don't work. Otherwise, the government wouldn't be trying to force Google and Meta to pick up the tab because the taxpayers have been subsidizing. And I don't just mean the CBC with 1.4 billion. I mean, all news organizations have been getting cash from the government, which is a whole questionable proposition we'll get into in a moment. But just this notion that they are going to quit caring, explain the difference between why Google would do one thing and Meta or Facebook would do would have a different reaction.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it can be as simple as a difference in perspective in terms of the value of news on the platform. I mean, at the end of the day, if you are saying it is a negotiation about value, each company is going to come to this to say, well, okay, what is the value of news, of Canadian news on our platform? And even if we're not going to make money off this, how much are we actually willing to lose, let's say, in order to participate in this? And I think that Facebook or Meta has from the beginning made it clear that this just is not worth very much, that the media companies need Facebook far more than Facebook needs them. And so I don't think it's about being disloyal or undemocratic or not appreciating the news. It is, as Pablo Rodriguez had said, a simple business decision in which they say, listen, it's just not that valuable to us relative to the enormous cost expectations that the government has fed into this. In the case of Google, it's in particular, I think if this was just about Google News, then then I doubt that they would be having these discussions, because I suspect they could walk away. They have walked away from Google News in other countries. But to the extent to which this will limit their ability to have search results that surface news results. So it's not necessarily people looking for that immediate news per se, but rather the fact that they want to have a valuable search engine that links to all the information people might be looking for. There is obviously value there. There is a cost to the company and a concern, I would think, to the company that if anyone who is included in its search index suddenly says, well, you've got to pay for the privilege of being included in that index, then that company ceases to exist. So it's clearly a tough issue. It's one that they've raised concerns on from the beginning, but given the links in the legislation to paying for links, given the basic uncapped liability here, where you don't even know going in how much it's going to be. Companies saying, listen, this is just something we can't handle. And so it is interesting, though, that a government that for weeks or months was really unwilling to engage in any sort of talks, notwithstanding Pablo Rodriguez famously saying, they've got my cell phone number. It appears that there weren't really a whole lot. They may not have had it. And at a minimum, nobody seemed to be using that line of communication.
Well, I mean,
it's only when they came to realize this was real that they suddenly said, hey, maybe we ought to have a conversation.
He said that all along. You heard it at our committees and other places. We dismissed that they're just bluffing. And I mean, there were times in our process of listening to witnesses and including the minister himself that there didn't seem to be a true understanding of what this legislation was. I think he did the kind of Cole's Notes version when somebody briefed him, and they didn't really think this through as to what the implications of this. If I want to go on and Google search, I want stories from 10 years ago and 20 years ago and 5 minutes ago and everything. That's a costly proposition that the companies have engaged in. And as a government, you can't just dismiss and say, I don't care, and I'm going to make you pay more. And, you're going to pay for an industry that has not shown the legacy media that it knows how to function in the modern world.
Yeah. Oh, listen, I thought it was telling, and it happened both at the House and at the Senate committees, that when the minister appeared, he was asked in both appearances, what's your plan B? If this isn't a bluff? Right. And there was no plan B. It was just, they must be bluffing, or, the kind of harsh tone and rhetoric involving these companies. And it was only occasionally a bit of a throwaway here or there that, well, perhaps we have options like perhaps stopping government advertising, but it's just, clearly that's not viewed, at least within the companies, as a sufficient threat to their economics relative to the costs associated with the bill. And even there, one wonders, I mean, one can well imagine they will, if this does follow through in the way that it looks like it will, one can well imagine the government going to town with stopping advertising and assortment of other things. But
that was sort of part of the problem in the first place. If they'd kept advertising in some of the local newspapers, they'd still be alive.
Well, listen, I'm someone who's of the view that government advertising is not designed to be a subsidy model. It is designed to communicate and educate the public on issues. There are programs you have to try to support various media and others. The idea that advertising is specifically used as that kind of leverage, I mean, then it suggests that this advertising isn't so much about informing Canadians or reaching them. It's more about leveraging the power that you might have to incent certain kinds of policy options. But I will say one of the things that will be interesting, if they do block news, what happens come election campaign? Would the Liberal Party, for example, which ran just in the recent by-elections hundreds of Facebook ads, in the prior election thousands of Facebook ads, would they cede the social media turf to opposition parties by saying, well, our principle is we don't advertise on Facebook, so they don't advertise on Facebook?
Yeah, I think I had a very good old Liberal friend who used to say, of his own party, which he loved, we have principles, and if you don't like those, we have others. And I think they might fund others when it comes to an election campaign, because you raise a really good point. The other thing that troubles me is this is so fundamental to somebody who spent a good part of her adult life in the journalism world, that we have seen such a denigration of the industry by accepting direct subsidies from government. It's a compromise of your ability to provide critical coverage. And I don't mean negative coverage. I mean small c critical coverage. You just, because everybody knows you won't bite the hand that feeds. And so now we've got government subsidies, and now the government is saying to these same journalists, now you're going to be beholden to big tech as well. So never mind the public, never mind people who might be subscribers, never mind those who think this is an important part of democracy. Just answer to your masters and write stuff we like.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point, and I never quite got the idea that somehow the way to ensure that there was health in the media sector was basically to create an environment where 2/3 of their news costs were either funded by the government through tax credits or by two Silicon Valley based companies. I mean, it seems to me that is such a threatening environment to long-term sustainability, both the ability to withdraw some of that support, change in government or change in view from the companies, and suddenly there's no company that could suddenly find 2/3 of its revenues eliminated for what is its major cost center and simply survive. I mean, it wouldn't happen. So it would make things even more precarious in many ways on a long-term basis. You're just so beholden, and the ability to claim trust, the ability to claim independence when you are beholden to those entities. I mean, it's just a very hard case to make. And I thought that, when I appeared before a committee, I raised my own personal experience where I had an op-ed killed by one of the major media outlets and it was made clear to me that this was just not the line that the paper was taking at that point in time, because they are in the midst of lobbying for this legislation. And, Senator Harder said, "Oh, we've all had circumstances where people make those decisions." But I genuinely believe that any truly objective review of the kind of coverage that this legislation got, particularly from the large media outlets that were supportive of this legislation, they'll find it was entirely one-sided, and ultimately, I think, is in some ways a sign of things to come, where you lose credibility when that's the position you take. And I should note that as we record this, there's just been reports about Bell executives getting involved and interfering in terms of the kind of coverage they want of their own company, and whether or not things are balanced enough and the like. And one can only imagine the government's response if Google or Facebook had instructed, their engineers to tinker with the algorithm to ensure that
Oh,
only positive Google stories appeared
yeah,
for people. And they would go ballistic, rightly so. You would
rightly
never
so.
envision something like that. Yet when it's a Canadian media company that does it, it's crickets.
Yeah, no, and we saw this at the beginning when Stephen Guilbeault was still the minister. He was perhaps a little cruder about what the intention was, is that, saving democracy means not being critical of his party's positions, and that this is not a democracy. That is what we see in China and other non-democratic thug states. The thing, and this is something that has always guided me. So these are the words of Edward R. Murrow. To be persuasive, we must be believable. To be believable, we must be credible. And to be credible, we must be truthful. It seems obvious, but it isn't. And and I think that part of the problem that they're having about being persuasive is that they're not believable and they're not truthful on this. They were putting out doctored data about the public wanting more controls on the internet when the question was, do you want more controls on hate speech? Just all of those things. And anybody with the ability to read and really do some homework could find out that they have been distorting the case for this. So here we are at a point now where everybody's questioning this, and they don't have any even trust to fall back on because they've kind of burned that bridge.
Yeah, it's an interesting point to raise. It's been a discouraging, on a personal level, it's been a discouraging process. I get involved and have been actively involved, obviously, in both of these bills, in part because I genuinely believe in a policy process where if you bring forward evidence-based issues, if people raise these issues with their elected representatives, with Parliament, there's the ability to have some amount of influence. And it feels as if in this instance, the door was shut really from the moment the legislation was introduced, indeed, probably even before that. In the case of C-18, I can recall back to when this was before the House, and you had a liberal MP after just a few hearings, one in which Facebook Meta had not even appeared before committee yet, saying, "Okay, I've heard enough. Let's move to clause by clause." And I mean, when you say the quiet part out loud, or when Lisa Hepner, the Liberal MP from Hamilton Mountain, says, online news isn't real news, I think that really does undermine credibility on these issues, and I think it's got long-term dangerous consequences, not just for these policies. I mean, obviously, I've got real concerns with these policies, but I think the implications for trying to encourage public participation in these processes, to basically say that this is something worth your time, it is worth speaking out, that it is a process that is based upon evidence and public participation, and yet, the bad taste that I think this leaves for a lot of people is that this felt like this was a done deal before things even got started, and that this is consultation theater at best rather than real consultation.
It's a really good phrase. And when we go back to C11, which we've kind of forgotten about because of all the focus on C18, but it's moving forward. And you remember what the young internet creators, the people in this country, thousands of them that are generating content that people globally are watching, they're making their living on it, and they said, no, we're not going to regulate those guys, but they are, as JJ McCullough said, it's impossible to regulate a platform like YouTube without regulating user content. You can't separate them.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the policy direction does seek to have them exclude, and they've certainly pointed in that direction. But to me, I always came back with the CRTC to the claims that it's evidence based. It's show up. It's basically based on you got to show up and you got to participate in their processes. And as this goes through, we already see a CRTC rushing through a process, rejecting a request from both supporters and critics of the bill. This came from Unifor and Friends of Canadian Broadcasting just as much as it came from those who've been critical of the legislation, to say, can we pump the brakes just a little bit to give us time to actually participate effectively? That leaves aside the view, and I expressed that they should not be moving ahead at all until the policy direction was final, so that people are participating based on a knowledge of how the CRTC has been instructed to interpret the legislation. But even if you park that, we had the commission reject two requests for 2 out of the 3 consultations for any extension at all. And then on the other one, they said, we'll give you a couple of weeks, which was less than people had asked for. And I must admit, I can't understand the logic behind sort of racing through that. And, as I'm working now on a reply to some of the submissions, it's clear that any number of groups on some of these issues said, listen, we didn't have enough time to be able to craft the kind of response that would be provide you with, a more fulsome evidence-based submission. And that can't possibly be in the CRTC's interest to structure something in a way that they have a poor evidentiary record. I just don't understand what the thinking is behind that.
This is the problem when it's all about being a political deliverable, right? Which is promise made to Quebec, promise kept, right? So all political parties always get ready for campaigns 24/7. And I think that's the problem. And so there's not logic to this and not sure the public understands. This happens repeatedly with legislation. A piece of legislation comes down, but the details, the nitty-gritty on what it means, who's going to have to pay, who's first on the list, who's bottom, that's all done in regulations, which is all after the fact, and nobody gets to see them before you vote on them or are forced to live under them. It's not a good process.
No, it's a terrible process. And I realize that some of these areas are fast moving, and there is an argument that on certain issues you want to maintain some amount of flexibility, though. Even the regulation making process can be so long. I can recall on copyright and concerns back in 2012 about some of the digital lock rules and the exceptions process, and the government responded by saying, well, don't worry. And note that was conservative government at the time. So this is not a partisan issue. Don't worry, there'll be plenty. We'll use regulations to address your concerns. And here we are 11 years later, and there have been no regulations coming out to address what have now become repeated concerns on some of these issues. So these are very real issues. The idea that MPs or senators are voting on legislation when it's basically just half of the bill and the rest is all to be determined. You should. I for one don't believe that you should get through a legislative process and have more uncertainty when you leave than you had when you started. And I feel that that's what we ended up with in many respects with this legislation. And I think that creates enormous risks, I think, to people in the sector. It creates enormous risk to the public. And it's just it's seeking the mission accomplished banner when you haven't accomplished the mission.
Yeah. Promise made, promise kept, even though we have no idea whether that's true. Alternatives. We have seen with the government's intent on the environmental front that, oil and gas needs to change its ways, but also shrink. So we've heard a lot about the just transition for people that work there. That was an alternative here in terms of dealing with people in the legacy media, to find a way for people to exit and be reskilled or retrained. They're fine with it in other sectors. It seems like perhaps that was a consideration. And I'm sure you've looked through it, the Peter Menzies, Conrad von Finkenstein report, saying, look, why don't we do it the other way and maybe give a tax break to people who subscribe to legacy media, who actually are interested in the content. Like, there are other things out there to do rather than this kind of draconian and really not very efficient model.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think there are some really interesting ideas, and it's unfortunate that they didn't seem to generate much interest from the government. That, we do have a tax break right now for digital news subscribers. It doesn't seem to move the needle all that much, but certainly might be worth considering in a broader context as well. But I think that if the government became so focused on getting the platforms. And in this case, it's just two platforms, really is
Yeah,
just
because there are
Meta
others.
and Google. And it's as if the links that you might see on Twitter or through Microsoft or on TikTok don't count. The world, I wrote a piece on this for the Global a week or two ago, the world of generative AI, which is
Yeah,
everybody agrees this is where a lot of this is headed. And yet this bill is crafted as if generative AI doesn't even exist. It's not an argument for the bill. It's actually an argument against the bill because
exactly.
generative AI is just not even included here. And so, it got just so stuck in this particular approach and saying, okay, this is what we're going to do. And anybody who disagrees doesn't believe in democracy or doesn't believe in
Right.
journalism, and big tech is evil. And I think that at the end of the day, the most discouraging aspect of that kind of approach is that it is Canadians who need this news and the news outlets themselves who are really going to pay the price.
Yeah. So where is this? What happens to these other platforms? Because the legislation is silent. A lot of this information and linkage occurs on Twitter. I mean, I don't want to. I don't want to put them in the spotlight. I don't mean that because I think the behavior toward the other two is such an intervention in the market. What is that? The next shoe to drop?
Yeah, no, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how some of this plays out. They have structured this in a way, at least for now, that does not include these companies. But, I think you can take a look at the history on this. I did a podcast this week with Mark Edge,
Yeah.
writes a book about post media, but with to me, the most interesting part was to just sort of take that kind of step back and see how this is part of what has been an ongoing lobbying effort by certain companies and associations. And, it started with local journalism initiative, which wasn't viewed as good enough. Then it moved to some of the tax breaks and tax credits, which still wasn't viewed as good enough. And so then it moved to Google and Facebook. Based on where it looks like we're headed, there's no doubt that won't be good enough. If anything, it represents a step backward. And so there is little reason not to believe that the next step will be to say, well, hold on a second. There's lots of stuff happening now in generative AI. How come ChatGPT isn't paying? Or TikTok's become really important. So how come they're not paying? And so is this the end of the line for these kinds of approaches? I suspect not. I think this will be ongoing for as long as government shows itself, willing to entertain some of these lobbying efforts and really largely dismiss those that are putting up some big red signals saying, there's some real problems and risks associated with what you're doing.
Conrad von Finkelstein, former chair of the CRTC, says a couple of things. It's not fit for purpose. It will have to be, the CRTC will need to be beefed up. There'll be hundreds more people to try and deal with both C11 and C18. They have no expertise at all in dealing with the print world. They're a broadcast regulator. And so that's a whole other complication, which is you're forcing the companies to go out and sign deals within the next 6 months and come to these, maybe rewrite the ones they've got or rip them up. But we don't have the structure in place to actually monitor, deal with, which is what they're told they must do, to monitor these deals. And the details of the deals are going to be secret. They're going to be secret because the same people, the big newspapers lobbying for this funding, doesn't want to tell the people, the public, how much funding they're getting from these guys. Like, this is pretty crazy.
It is. And I have to say that the idea that this is going to happen in this short time frame and we're going to see some great outcomes just is first increasingly unlikely. And second, I'm glad you raised the transparency issue because we did see repeated attempts by government to say, well, this is not the Australian model. It's a better version of the Australian model. And here's why it's more transparent. And while there have been real criticisms about the lack of transparency associated with that Australian model, it's one thing, and I thought, frankly, it became clear at your committee when you get the proponents of the Australian model from Australia have to acknowledge that, well, we know what the outcomes were, but we're not really able to tell you some of the specifics.
We're not telling you, right?
And in Canada, the structure is such that You even had supporters of the legislation. The day I appeared before Committee Friends of Canadian Broadcasting said, we need better transparency. And you had a number of groups make that case. And so the government could say, well, it's more transparent. The CRTC puts out a report, but the devil's in the details, as they say on many of these things, and we won't know the details.
Just a final quick point here. The other thing that Conrad von Finkenstein said is this is probably going to end up in court. We're fooling around with trade deals, trying to impose Canadian law on foreign companies. There are some charter questions about our access as a public and as individuals to news and information, et cetera. Do you think we're going to see that?
Yeah, it depends a little bit if the companies the internet companies play ball or not. It seems quite likely that, as we say, Meta will not. Are they going to sue over the legislation if they walk away? I'm not so sure. I think there are real reasons to have concerns around this compliance of this legislation, both with our treaty obligations, in the copyright realm, it's in the trade realm as well. Constitutionally, whether or not this is even something within the federal government's powers. So I think there are a lot of these kinds of questions. Part of an answer to the question, are we going to see litigation? It's going to require someone to sue or to challenge in court. And that's where I think there's a little bit more uncertainty. If you get companies that are just out altogether, well, then they're out. And I don't know that they would. And if they are in and manage to strike a compromise, then again, I don't know that they would. Might Canadian media try to use somehow this legislation to sue those that are out? I suppose that's a possibility. I think that at least in the short term, it feels more likely that this is going to just kind of linger in the background as a potential risk. And that's unlike C11, which I think will have the CRTC process play out. And at the very end of that process, once the CRTC has rendered its decisions, we see any number of groups step forward and seek review.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I personally see it as an infringement on my right to choose the information I want to consume. Michael, thank you so much. You've been a rock through all of this stuff and appearing at committees and always having more insight as we go down this rabbit hole here. So thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on again.
Michael Geist, law professor, University of Ottawa. He is the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law, member of the Center for Law, Technology and Society. And thank you for doing all of that. All right. Talk to you soon. Have a great summer.
Thanks, you too.
That's it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We'll see you soon.